All right. So now that you have some grounding in why EUs and EQs, let's talk about some considerations for actually building them. So again, back to that enduring understanding, your ability to make essential questionnaires of your students is the most powerful, long-term, important determinant of your success as a teacher. If your students are asking good questions and solving complex problems because of articulating those questions, then you've created a student who can move into a novel situation and maneuver flexibly with their skills. That's our ultimate goal, our transfer goal for any unit of study or any course that we teach at NACA. So what makes a question essential? Well, let's first look at some of the big problems with most questioning that happens in schools. This is from a book called Quality Questioning, and there are 6 research findings that are pretty fascinating about the way that most questioning works in schools. The first is teachers ask many questions, and that's great. The second, though, is most teacher questions are at the lowest cognitive level, known as fact, recall, or knowledge. I think we can all envision ourselves in the classroom asking questions of this nature. Number 3, not all students are accountable to respond to all questions. Teachers frequently call on volunteers, so bringing into question strategies like cold calling and the like. Research finding number 4 is fascinating, that teachers typically wait less than 1 second after asking a question before calling on a student to answer. So the idea of wait time. What's even more interesting is the second part of this. They wait even less time, usually 0 seconds, before speaking after a student has answered. So a huge issue with developing questioners of our students, or essential questioners of our students, is that most of us aren't taking the time to allow students to answer complex questions. Number 5, teachers often accept incorrect answers without probing. One of the key skills of a teacher who embraces essential questions is the ability to probe with follow-up questions. Why did you say that? Can you give me evidence for your answer? Things of that nature. And they frequently answer their own questions. And lastly, students ask in the course of a given class very few content-related questions. So maybe the question is, can I go to the bathroom? But we want questions to be not only related to content, but be related to the why and the so what of the content. That's a huge indication of how well we're doing in developing questioners of NACA students. So I'm going to skip this conversation of EUs and move on to building EUs and EQs and a few considerations. So the first thing that we all need to know is that we went through the process of building big ideas or unpacking big ideas and assessment verbs in our standards and elsewhere for a reason. And that's because they become the anchor of the entire unit or the course of study or whatever whatever the curriculum is that we're building, whatever the amount of time that we're building around. So you choose a big idea to anchor your year, your unit, or your lesson. Again, the 3 stages of UBD should apply to all 3 of those levels. You UBD your year, you UBD your units, and you UBD your lessons. And that big idea is sacred. It truly is an anchor. It's what drives the entirety of the unit. So here's an example. A big idea might be main idea in a language arts class. And an EQ that's well done is, why do we care about finding main idea? The other EQ, which says bad next to it, is not a bad question. What are the parts of a story? But it doesn't carry with it the central focus of main idea. And the importance here is on alignment. So maybe you really like the second question and you need to change your big idea. So the big idea becomes, rather than main idea, it becomes parts of a story or story structure, right? So the whole point here is alignment and making sure that you're aligned to that big idea that you've said is going to drive the entirety of your planning. The next consideration is whether or not you're dealing with a universal or a topical EU and EQ. So you have to choose how to frame your unit. That is your job as a designer. You are framing for students how to conceptualize of the content that you're going to teach. And so I often get the question, well, should I go more universal or more topical? And ultimately that has to come down to a designer, their understanding of their content, and how they want to frame for their students. So there's some wiggle room there, but there are implications. If you have a more universal EU and EQ, you have more applicability and greater opportunity for transfer. If you have a more topical EU and EQ, you're placing the emphasis on specific discipline-oriented content. And I could see folks wanting to make that decision. I could see in a math class wanting to focus specifically on, say, variables or formulas rather than something perhaps a little bit more transcendent or universal, but the choice being that it's framing for students the content in a more precise way. And again, that's the teacher's prerogative to design that way. So again, the last bullet point, there is no right answer in terms of a designer's decision here, but let's explore it a little bit more. In a middle school math class, here are a couple of ideas. A topical big idea might be algebra. Why do we know it's more topical? Because it is less transferable. It doesn't necessarily relate to other disciplines. So an EU here might be, again, carrying down the big idea of algebra. Algebraic expressions and equations generalize relationships from specific cases. Or an essential question of how is thinking algebraically different than thinking arithmetically. So if we wanted to move more universal, let's say that, Paula is considering how she's going to frame her unit. She might frame it within the context of algebra, or she might look for a more universal term. And so a more universal term, and again, one easy way to say this is that it applies to various disciplines. So it could apply to a language arts class, a native lit class, a math class, and so forth. And that might be variables. Now, this is a little bit tricky because variables are arguably under the auspice of algebra, but they also are applicable because they have different meanings in different subjects. So an EU surrounding this that perhaps would be more universal would be that the meanings of variables, the very concept itself, changes based on the subject matter. So we have variables in math, we have variables in writing, we have variables in technical subjects, and the definition of which you can Google, changes based upon that subject matter. And then the question around this could be, why do various disciplines use common terminology that differs in definitions? So again, the choice there that a middle school math teacher has to make is, am I going to frame this unit or this school year in something that is broader, more universal, and therefore allows for greater transfer, or am I going to frame strictly within the terms of my discipline? And again, that's a designer's prerogative. Here's another example. Maybe a high school humanities class. A topical big idea might be the writing process, with an EU of the writing process requires a mix of structure and creativity. And an EQ of why is the balance of structure and creativity essential in the writing process. A more universal choice would be perhaps patterns, because the writing process is built upon a structure and patterns. And so maybe it's the case that Emily or Damien is developing a unit, and it's around a sort of larger big idea of patterns, which of course is a very universal big idea that connects every discipline that we teach at NACA in some way or another. And so the EU that Damien or Emily might choose might be patterns and relationships can be represented numerically, graphically, symbolically, and verbally. This is more broad, it's more transferable than the example number one above. And how do I express a pattern to show a relationship? Again, we could be moving from classroom to classroom at NACA and having that sort of discussion. So again, a designer's prerogative. Here's another way to look at EUs and EQs, that there are types of EUs and EQs. There are generally 4 types that are discussed, not in the textbook UBD, but I've seen in conferences with the authors of UBD. And they usually break them down into 4 categories. And it's an interesting way to think about what you're asking of your students, what you're requiring of your students in terms of their answers to a question or their ability to think through a big idea. It's philosophical, and this of course requires students to explore the why and the so what of study. I think we're all pretty grounded in these philosophical essential questions. There's epistemological, and I think this is a really interesting place to explore with students, and those require us to question what's known as justified true belief. So the key questions here, and I'm going to give you examples of each of these in a moment, but who created information or knowledge as we know it? Who is disseminating that information? And why should we be skeptical about what we really call knowledge as human beings? There's meaning making, and these are essential questions or enduring understandings that require students to take various content taught in a class and articulate the meaning of that content to a larger whole. And this is an interesting one because some people would regard this as a lower level essential question when compared to philosophical or epistemological, in that it really requires students to analyze the content that would be taught in a traditional class but make meaning of it. And so I'm going to give you an example of what that looks like in just a minute. And the last is really important as well. And these are questions that require students to think about their own thinking, their own process, their own decisions, based upon their learning and how one goes about bettering oneself in terms of being a thinker or a problem solver in the classroom. So let's look at some examples of these. Philosophical. Why do we care about liberty? Why did the universe begin? Why do we need math? Epistemological, on the nature of knowing. Is knowledge invented or discovered? Or in terms of a specific class, how do we know blank? So in other words, how do we know that the Pythagorean theorem works? Who invented it? Why is it used, right? So this whole diving deep into how it came about, where did it come from, deconstructing the knowledge. This epistemological piece is really about taking a certain set of knowledge that we're providing students as a truth and saying, how do we know this? It's a matter of deconstructing what exists in order to find out why it matters. And the other question here is, who told us to believe blank? And why did they tell us that? In terms of meaning making, again, some would refer to them as lower level, but I think they're really important to frame a unit. And again, this is a designer's prerogative. What are the parts of a sentence? This might be in an ELA class. What are the parts of a sentence, and what role does each part play in clarity? So we're asking a question that, asks students to break down, maybe certain word types, how you end a sentence, how you begin a sentence, that sort of thing. But more importantly, making meaning out of each of those parts that contribute to the whole. Another one that fits along these lines of meaning making are, what are the steps in the scientific process, and why does each step exist? So it's about understanding the scientific process, but asking ourselves, how do the component parts fit into a coherent whole? So again, these meaning making can really focus us on the content that we're teaching, so that we're not constantly contending at a philosophical level. And I think there's a good reason to think about those in all of our classes. And lastly, there's metacognitive, thinking about our thinking and thinking about how to improve, one of which is, what strategies did I use to comprehend the text, perhaps in an ELA class? Or maybe it's, what strategies did I use to solve the problem? Another might be, what is my reaction to a piece of literature tell me about my own preconceptions? And another one that's one of my personal favorites is, what do effective problem solvers do when they run into a problem, right? So this whole idea of, and that really transcends disciplines. What do I do when I get to a place in a problem, a math problem, a reading problem, wherever it is? What do effective problem solvers do? How do they go about tackling complex problems that they don't know the answer to? A metacognitive skill that I think almost all of our students, and probably each of us, could really benefit from. So again, back to the big idea. Your ability to make essential questioners of your students is the most important long-term determinant of your success as a teacher. And we just went through a few possibilities of what makes a question essential.